Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce. Is it now? I want to present to you a discussion I had with David Fuller of Rebel Wisdom Media. Rebel Wisdom Media does a lot of documentaries and interviews with key members of the IDW, like people who actually call themselves the IDW, and then members of the sub-IDW, or whatever that thing is, which is something that we actually talk about. We're both kind of into interviewing, so it's kind of interesting. We get into his past, we get into my past, and then we converge on topics of mutual interest, such as censorship and the progressive religion, quote unquote, and our responsibility as content creators, not only in the journalistic capacity or in a commentating capacity and showing or shaping discourse, but also forming bridges between people who want to be engaged in a certain level of discourse. And this was a great discussion for me. I hope you enjoy it. Here you go. David Fuller.
Yeah, Benjamin, really good to talk to you and record it and show people the results.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pretty busy year or couple years for you now. When did you start working with Jordan Peterson?
So I did the first interview, my first interview with Jordan Peterson in October last year.
Okay.
And then turned it into the documentary Truth in the Time of Chaos that came out in January.
Okay.
And then through an amazing kind of set of what Jordan Peterson would call synchronicities, the glitch in the matrix came about in, I think, February, and that went pretty far and wide and really helped us kind of create an audience for the channel. Yeah. So Glitch in the Matrix was all about, because I used to work with Cathy Newman, he had the interview with Cathy Newman, it all sort of erupted at the same time. Yeah. And Glitch in the Matrix was the result.
Interesting. I did not know that you worked with Cathy Newman.
Up until about 3 weeks before that interview happened, and I knew in making the documentary that I was basically burning my bridges with Channel 4 and Channel 4 News, and I've since found out that I'm apparently banned from Channel 4 News now.
Oh, like the grounds, or just being mentioned there, or like
yes,
you're the one that shall not be
banned
mentioned?
From ITN. ITN make Channel 4 News. I was told the other day by someone, "Oh, you're the guy who's been banned from ITN."
Why were you banned? Did you present ideas that are not favorable to them? Did you cast them in a negative light, or did you just disagree with them?
I was critical of Cathy and critical of them in the piece. I kind of knew it would be at least very awkward for me to go back in there, but I don't know. I didn't necessarily know that. I knew I was taking a sort of leap out of one world and into another by doing it, but I was. I kind of was already thinking that my heart was elsewhere, let's put it that way.
Okay. Did you feel a sense of risk in that, or were you already resigned to making that potential loss or exchange?
I knew I'd pretty much already decided that it was time to try and create a channel based around my voice rather than working for a larger media company.
Okay.
So it all just felt like it was coming together it felt very aligned, that it was the right thing at the right time. I actually, at the beginning of that process, was trying to liaise between Cathy Newman and Jordan Peterson in the aftermath of that interview, asking them to do another, or Jordan wanted to do another interview, and I was suggesting to Cathy that would be a good idea, given the outcome of the first one. She and Channel 4 weren't keen, Jordan Peterson was keen, but in the end, Glitch in the Matrix was the result of that kind of position I found myself, I guess.
Yeah, I remember watching that interview, and the moment I watched that interview, like it was the day that it came out, or maybe the day after, whenever it was posted to the internet, I watched it right away. And I knew that was going to be Jordan's coming out party. That was his debutante party for the larger, he was going to the next level. He had already become kind of a name in the YouTube social justice and anti-social justice discussion, and on Twitter too. He was gaining steam, but that launched him. And just looking at like the amount of videos that were made about that interview, and every channel that made a video about that interview, like they were boosted up too. Everybody who started talking about that, it was a huge effect that rippled through a lot through, at least through the YouTube community, and connected a lot of us to each other and brought certain people that I've been in contact with since then into contact, or put them on my map. So it was an interesting subsequent effect just beyond just Peterson. Like,
yeah,
it made him more.
I mean, that was sort of where the title "Glitch in the Matrix" came from, and I think the first lines in it was, sometimes something just punches through in a way that you don't expect, and it just shows how the old operating system is breaking down. And very much in that you just had this kind of very robotic script that couldn't cope with something else, and the something else was Jordan Peterson's kind of, I guess, what Eric Weinstein would call first principle thinking. First principle thinkers don't fit into boxes very easily. You can't predict what they're going to say about any particular subject by any of their other views, because they've worked them out from first principles up.
Oh, okay. But what, I guess we're playing with Eric's toys here, but what happens when two first principle thinkers interact? Well,
that's pretty much what the IDW is, I guess, isn't it? Two first principle thinkers with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, or I think all of the IDW would probably frame themselves as first principle thinkers, and I'd say most of them are. Even Ben Shapiro, who I kind of wouldn't see eye to eye with on many issues, talks about the levels of the iceberg, that you really need to go down the iceberg to realize where you're actually disagreeing, rather than staying at the surface, at a surface disagreement. You've got to see what are your principles, what are your axioms. And I say most of them come from that perspective. Fascinated to talk about your background as well, because you're ploughing a very similar furrow, and from being very close to the action at Evergreen.
Yeah, Evergreen's where I started talking about all this stuff. And actually, in one of my last classes, my professor, I did a lot of communications studies, linguistics, and creative writing, even though I despise that term, but just effective communication. And one of my professors told the story about the vagina monologues, which is apparently now getting banned left and right because of the decoupling.
Because it's transphobic.
Yeah, it's the suffering from the decoupling of the vagina from the female. But he told the story of how the vagina monologues came to be, and the author, whose name escapes me right now. Eve Ensler. She was working on other things. She was writing all these other projects, and she just had this idea about, like, I guess, a vagina talking. And she just started, like, in the margins of what else she was working on, she just started drafting these little scripts and these little, jotting these notes and having these little dialogues and stuff. And so the way that my professor framed that as a writing prompt was to look at what you're doing that you're not really focused on, like stuff that's going on in your periphery that you're kind of like thinking about and talking about, because you never know that might be the thing that you'd be known for, or that might be the gateway into a new field. And that really aligns with what I'm doing now, because I was really focused on communication and on fiction and on linguistics and communications and all that theory. And in the periphery, I was watching what was going on the internet. I was watching what was going on specifically through Reddit and YouTube. And Jordan Peterson had been on my radar since when I came across some talk he gave on Nietzsche. I think it was called 40 Minutes on 2 Lines of Nietzsche or something like that. And I'm like, oh, this is a guy that is worth listening to. And so I just started going through all his different lectures and stuff, and thinking a lot about that, and watching the college that I was at, Evergreen State College, which is hyper progressive. And when I first got there, I was kind of an older person. I kind of laughed it off, but over time, like, it started getting ingrained in me, like this hyper progressive, very social justice mindset. And what I saw was some disturbing trends among the faculty and the administration. And I kind of tried to speak out about that. And what happened in the spring of 2017, on May 23rd, Brett Weinstein Weinstein got protested. I didn't know who Brett Weinstein was at this point. He got protested, and then the next day, the protesters had taken over the library building and blockaded the library building and went around and like rounded up teachers and like held them. I guess at will. The administration was there by their own volition, but the police, anyways. And the students had filmed the whole thing or live streamed the whole thing, and the behavior that they elicited was egregious, absolutely indefensible. And that's what brought a lot of the attention to Evergreen. But I had seen that behavior happening more and more and more. And I kept on trying to tell people in the administration and my bosses there and my professors that you cannot teach young people this whole privilege politics stuff because they're just giving themselves, it's just basically empowerment without etiquette is a license to be an asshole. Basically, you're only teaching them half of the equation. You're giving them power, but you're not teaching them how to actually use the power. And so they're just blaring, and I was getting really angry and disgusted with that before it even blew up. But after it blew up, it changed the entire college, at least in that week after that event happened. And I was watching how the internet was playing with this because it's wonderful fodder for the YouTube commentary community, and even just anybody who's interested in academics, anybody who's worried about the state of culture. Everything boils down into those probably about 6 or 8 hours of footage of what happened at Evergreen, not even including what happened with Brett. But that's when I started, because nobody was talking about it who was there other than Brett, I just started talking about it into a camera, and little did I know that there's this huge market or huge amount of eyeballs that are really interested in looking at this stuff. And I subconsciously built several tools to be able to investigate it. So that's how I kind of got into this.
Yeah, you found yourself right at the center of probably, I'd still say that Evergreen and Brett's story is the most clear example of where this thing can go when it goes wrong.
Oh yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And what's extraordinary is that you've got all of that material, and I know you're working on a documentary about it that I think could be one of the most essential pieces to understand, just the psychology of this worldview.
Even students who were there in the midst of the craziness, they were trying to tell people, like Chinese students, who were then told to be quiet because they were too pale, were trying to tell students like that this happened in my country. This happened, like what we're doing now is what happened in the Cultural Revolution. Like this is the same thing. You guys really need to slow down. So it really maps on to I don't know if you agree with the terms cultural Marxism. I have some problems, or I understand that there's a problem with that term. And Peterson,
it's a loaded term just because of the overuse, I think. But it's certainly pointing to something real.
Yeah.
I know a friend of mine actually had lunch with today said he just read Wild Swans, which is a book about a family in China all the way through the rise of Mao and the Cultural Revolution, and he said it was just staggering. Even compared to the Gulag Archipelago, he said this was more intense. And it mapped on so clearly to some of the trends that we're seeing in culture at the moment. And he's a writer, he's a novelist, so really feels the attack on the individual voice. That's something that's really interesting. It's another of our interviewees, Jordan Greenhall, said something really fascinating, which is that there's something in the ambient environment at the moment that fears truth. And I think fears the individual voice. This fits into a lot of what I've seen Eric Weinstein talk about as well, is that what we're seeing at the moment is a kind of a war on heterodox thinkers. That there is some force that fears individuality in some sense. And I think that's partly at the root of this.
Well, you can't really get to yourself without venturing into heretical or at least heterodox waters. And you lose a lot of comfort and safety once you embark on that journey. Like, let's map it on to Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces. Like, the Hero of the Thousand Faces is that there's one individual that has to go through a whole bunch of different phase changes. And one of those major changes is departing from the safety net of the culture that you find yourself in. And what I've seen at Evergreen, and there's one critique that's running that recurs in the people who are looking at this and who are talking about this, is that social justice ideology maps very well onto a religious doctrine. I think that there's some nuance that needs to be injected into the conversation. What's the difference between a cult and a religion? I think that the cult is a negative thing. I think religion isn't a negative thing. I don't think that religion itself is negative for a number of different reasons, but there's something very cult-like. And if you look at people who get into cults and have to go through certain steps of deprogramming from a cult, there's certain sorts of ways that you get sucked into a cult and certain things that you need to do to get out of it that are alive and well in the grievance studies, social justice, progressive mindset. There's a lot of you're praised for certain characteristics that make you feel good, but even though you're being praised for individual characteristics, that's not the same thing. Your identity is not necessarily the same thing as your individuality.
This is such a difficult thing to pull apart as well, because you're trying to hold the complexity of two perspectives. Like there's a huge reaction to this from the right, for example. And so a lot of the reaction against the social justice groupthink is easily characterized by people as, well, this is just coming from the right. But I think the complexity that has to be held is these are good values. Inclusivity is a good value. Treating people with respect is a good value.
Yes.
But if you make these your primary axioms, then they tend to lead to madness. If you make inclusivity and diversity your primary axioms rather than the dignity of the individual, for example, rather than self-realization, rather than free speech, then you're in danger of, like, if you make care rather than truth your fundamental value, then you're in very dangerous waters very, very quickly, because by definition you are going to then have to stop certain people speaking if you think that what they're saying is not is in danger of offending others. For example, it's about, and that's where it maps onto the religious mindset really, really clearly. It's like your religious or cult, your religious perspective is, what are you making your primary axioms? What are you making your primary values? Yeah. And that's a very delicate conversation to be had, because it's very easy to say this whole social justice world is a cult and we've got to fight back against it, and it's in danger of becoming a new religion. But to be able to hold the complexity of saying, we're not saying your values are wrong, we're saying that taken to an extreme they become wrong. Like it's almost like threading an eye of a needle to make that conversation or make those points in a way that allows people to hear them if they're already minded to go along with this sort of very black and white narrative of goodies versus baddies, and you see what I mean?
Yeah, well, another thing, I think it's been said a number of times before, but what happens through the QOLT process is that it's almost like, that first scene in Indiana Jones, the first one, Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he goes into the temple and he swaps out that gold bag with the statue. I don't want to get too Petersonian, but what happens is there's this swapping out of the ideology with the individual, where the individual's taken out and what's replaced is the ideology. So any criticism of the ideology feels like a personal attack. And that doesn't necessarily have to be tied into the care principle, the care harm principle, but at the same time, I think that can happen anywhere. Any ideology, any religion taken into that extreme where it's an imposition rather than a journey of self-discovery. It's a communal rite of passage into a unification. Has the capacity to have to stir up a lot of defensiveness whenever somebody criticizes that.
And also at its extreme, when you really cannot tell the difference between someone attacking you and someone attacking your views, it's actually kind of a definition of personality disorder in an individual. that there is some sense that what we're seeing, and Peterson has kind of referred to this as well, that at the real extremes of this ideology, it's dysfunctional to that extent.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I've experienced that with some individuals where they're disagreeing with their view is the same as hurting them personally.
Yeah.
It's like there's almost no division between someone's story about themselves and themselves.
Yeah. The one formula that I found while at Evergreen and hearing the arguments in play, watching this ideology play itself out inside of people, was that everybody claimed that their experience was true and right, and you could never question their experience. And I just kept on trying to say, it's like, okay, I'm not questioning your experience, I'm questioning your interpretation of your experience. And those are two different things. And if we can't separate those things, then we're never going to be able to actually find any common ground, because my experience is inherently different than yours. And another pattern that I see when you bring up the same people, and I hate the formula, the same people who, but I see this a lot, the same people who have a hard time differentiating their individuality from their identity or themselves from their ideology. They're the same people who do a lot of ad hominem attacks, who actually reduce you into a category, reduce you into an ideology yourself.
They make your views and your identity synonymous.
Yeah, they do. The thinking is not only on the defense, but it's on the offense. It's and we can say that it's fallacious. It's a fallacious way of going about dialogue.
But it's a completely self-enclosed and logically consistent perspective in its own right, in a sense. Or it's a self-enclosed system. It may not be logical, but it's certainly self-enclosed if you've identified someone with their views.
Yeah. And it is stable up to a point with regards to the way that we see online mobs forming, and they're on the left and the right. But these identity groups that are very focused on identity at the sacrifice of the individual, they can form a pack. But what happens is that pack starts to weed out anybody who starts to show individual characteristics. So it's kind of like a mind virus in a way that can get so big. It can be stable to a certain extent and have a lot of force. At the expense of what, though?
I guess you have quite a lot of lived experience of this.
You don't? Do you feel that you're one step removed? Do you feel that your work is more interviewing people who critique this stuff, or do you do critiques of this stuff yourself and looking at the stuff?
We do critiques of this ourselves. I try to avoid these conversations as much as possible in real life. And I'm relatively successful at doing that. But
why?
And also the YouTube environment is obviously is already quite skeptical towards a lot of these viewpoints, and also trying to be a little bit careful about, as I said before, trying to pull apart. It's quite easy to get a reaction and to be. There's a whole subculture of reaction to this worldview, and it's very easy even to get sort of pulled into that your audience actually wants more of that. And I think a lot of people coming from a more heterodox perspective, there are sort of the two difficulties. One is being over influenced by that worldview, and then there's being too in reaction to it.
Yes.
And I guess we're trying with Rebel Wisdom to try and steer a course between the two. And it's difficult. It's not easy, but I mean, I guess I'm try to be a fairly agreeable person. While I think I actually got 2% on the test when I did the agreeability. Have you done Jordan Peterson's test of the Big Five personality traits?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think
you should try it. I got about 2% agreeability, so I can't be too agreeable.
Well, yeah, but there's maybe you're disagreeable in your head, but if you were sitting down and not doing this online, but somebody was there across from you, that you knew in real time, maybe your answers would change.
True. I try and avoid. Yeah, I guess I'm also British, so I try and avoid too much.
Oh yeah, that's true.
I can help it.
What you were saying about the difficulty of introducing heterodox ideas and promulgating the heterodox mindset is absolutely certain. You can get a lot of followers, you can get a lot of attention being against something. Being against something it's easy to define, it's easy to see. There's a lot of energy into that too, so you're animated, you're doing a lot of work.
The clickbait titles are a lot easier to write.
Yeah, exactly. And on the other hand, to be a centrist, to be a moderate is inherently weak. You're like, okay, well, there's this side and there's that side. To be nuanced slows everything down. There's an automatic decrease in passion, and the art is to try to keep on engaging with people and keep people engaged with you when you're entering into these deeper levels of discourse. So it seems like one trick, I don't know if this is a trick, I don't know if this is necessarily manipulative in a purely negative sense, but I think that one way of interacting with the online community or forming a community is to have like this tip of the iceberg that attracts people, where people understand like that's an object that I can name and somebody that I can relate to, but always try to lead deeper, always try to have that lead, that clickbait title that doesn't lead to a clickbait piece. The title's there to grab your attention, but there's actually a lot of other things going on in play.
Yes, and I have been very reassured by how many people do seem to respond to nuance. That it's a sort of process of refining the audience as well. I think our audience now know the sort of stuff that we're trying to do, to the extent that they're. I was reminded with what you were saying before, again, about another interview that we had with Jordan Greenhall, where he talks about thinking versus simulated thinking, which maps on quite well to the whole NPC meme that we've seen quite recently. And we actually did a discussion of the NPC meme that was based around this distinction between thinking and simulated thinking, and how genuine thinking is something that takes time. It's something that is actually... it starts to be actively selected against in some environments.
Yes.
And we've got a political system, for example, that is now selecting against thinking. We've got the culture of debate itself is selecting against thinking. If you're going into a debate where you're actually trying to think in real time, and you're trying to come up with generative ideas that's a vulnerable place to be if you're up against someone who's looking for any inconsistencies in what you're saying, or is coming from a very sort of solid and defined point. So you've got to, and this is a conversation, I recently came back from Portland, where I talked to Brett and Heather about how do you have public conversations that are genuinely thinking in public, that are genuinely generative. And they said the key point is safety. You cannot have those conversations unless you've established trust, unless you've established safety with the people that you're doing it with. Because as soon as you have anyone in that environment that is then looking to score points or is looking to have a victory, then you can't have those kind of conversations.
Yes.
And that also is I think what on some level the intellectual dark web is trying to carve out as well. It's relationships of trust and a kind of a space of mutual inquiry that can then generate, because creativity is by its nature generative. So if you're engaging in a conversation that is only coming from what the two people already think, there is no creativity, there is no possibility of generating anything new from that. So how do you bring in that level of openness and potential creativity? It has to be from a place of trust, which is a really interesting realization, I guess, and very difficult to achieve in this environment.
And it's a fraught goal, because in order to be in an inclusive environment, you have to be exclusive, and you have to exclude certain behaviors.
And that's the problem with the left, because they don't like boundaries, so they cannot exclude the people that need to be excluded.
And yet, if anybody just slightly crosses the line, they're out. So I don't know.
There are very specific boundaries, but they're not generally about who's arguing in good faith, who's arguing from a position of, can I change my mind? Do I want to have my mind changed, or am I open to having my mind changed? They have, I mean, usually it's tone policing, and usually it's any kind of expression of anger, any expression. So what they'll do is then frustrate the conversation to the point where the other person loses their temper, and then they've won. I mean, that's a classic kind of technique.
Well, the thing is, you brought up time, and it takes time to generate ideas, and it takes a certain sort of atmosphere, or a certain space, a certain spatial aesthetic, perhaps, of like, in good faith. There's probably certain principles that we could boil it down to. And one person that I interviewed, Ryan Bennett, who reacted to the Pangburn implosion by setting up a event to take the place of an event where was going to include IDW members, but then it got dissolved because of the ineptitude or whatever of the person who put it on. Ryan said that he was working out a protocol using the way that computers talk to each other as a metaphor. There's handshaking, and there's different just sorts of basic rudimentary formalities that allow for a network to form. And what are those formalities? What are the certain principles, the first principles that can generate almost like a fractal? Like there's this very narrow thread between too much chaos and too much order that is generative. And what are those first principles, and how do we contact people that have those first principles? And I think that is the true nature of what is now being called the intellectual dark web. The intellectual dark web as an exclusive group of, the Reservoir Dog style meme of, Eric and Brett and Ben and Jordan and Rogan and Ruben. What those guys represent is they're doing something that we can all watch. They're doing something in real time that we can all watch. So they're doing something actual. But what they represent is an intersection for people who want to have that sort of discourse themselves. And what is the potential of that, of modeling that sort of discourse with these larger than life characters? The potential of that is that smaller than larger than life, or just life-size characters, can go to these events, or at least use these events as meeting grounds to find each other and then have discussions on their own. And these people are, I think that they're the silent majority insofar as they refuse to boil their thinking down into terms that can be represented as slogans, that can be represented as arguments, that can be represented in ways that swivel a lot of heads, right? They're not the ones who are throwing Molotov cocktails or the ones shouting down speakers. They're the ones who are listening. And by the very act of listening, they're not as heard, or they're overlooked. But the IDW as a protocol might be able to be that which gives those people a voice.
Yeah, it's something we've called the meta conversation. What is the meta conversation that needs to take place? What are the preliminaries for a generative conversation to take place? Yeah. Which I think is very much in this. I really like that idea of a kind of protocol. So, like the basic need, the basic grounding for that conversation to take place would be a certain set of principles, a certain set of attitudes, and then the actual conversation can begin to happen. I like that as an overview. And something we found, we've been running events, sort of regular events in London, and something we found is when we have given people the space to talk about. In fact, one of the questions that we asked them, we gave them, so we did a little talk ourselves and then put them into smaller groups and said, okay, the topic of this group is, what do you believe but you're afraid to talk about? And the amount of energy in the room when people were given permission to talk about this stuff was just really extraordinary. There's such a desire among people to have these conversations. And I think we both agree that the IDW has to transition into some kind of cultural movement from the bottom up if it's to reach its full potential. I don't think that any person, I think by the very nature of the complexity of nuance, it can't be dictatorial. It cannot be top down.
But in like, maybe that's just one of the principles, that down at the root, we're either trying to get to being an individual or we're practicing being an individual. And that can't be imposed by figures on a stage, no matter how inspiring.
Yeah. Which is also one of the things that I think Pangburn, one of the many things Pangburn got wrong, but certainly I've heard the IDW described as an emergent conversation. Like, it's not entirely clear at the moment what it is ultimately going to look like. And what I think the mistake that Pangburn did was brought a very 20th century extractive model to a 21st century emergent conversation. And then you had many kind of manifestations of that, one of which is all these people who discovered a lot of these figures for free, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, suddenly found paywalls around everything, and it felt very off in terms of what they were used to, but also in terms of just restricting it evolving into what it could be. I think there was a real issue there, because I could see a model that involved live streaming much more than gatekeeping, that found new ways of monetizing it through people getting involved in the conversation rather than being excluded from the conversation and then being asked to pay up for the video in 2 months' time or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, you bring up monetization, and that's the other thing we were going to talk about. And I think that's a good pivot, to use a Pangburnianism, into how do independent creators who are serving the community do so at a certain level of consistency and both quality and then frequency without receiving monetary remuneration. How do we monetize this how do we present things of value to people who are used to having it for free? And is relying on the goodwill of the audience members enough, especially in a climate where relying on the goodwill of the corporation or, like Patreon that's connecting us to the customer is fraught. We can't really trust Patreon at this point.
The other factor is that these companies have deliberately created an environment where it's not only okay, it's encouraged to bring your politics to work, because they have realized that a lot of the people who are coming out of these universities want to join a company where they're encouraged to bring their values to work. We want the whole person to come into work, which in some sense is considered, well, that must be a good thing. We want a company that's aligned with our values. We want a company that's I hope that they're now seeing the danger of that as well. I mean, the whole Google James Damore situation surely shows the danger of saying, well, if you're bringing your values into work, now there are certain topics that are off the table, or there are only accepted ways of looking at things. And I think this is something that hopefully they're starting to realize. But I got a real sense from Patreon's decision that this seems to be coming from somewhere within the company. Like, someone within Patreon doesn't like Sargon. There's a lot of internal pressure to deplatform him, to deplatform Milo. This is pretty worrying.
It seems to me that if you try to silence the people who voted in Trump, you're going to actually increase their base. Like, and this is a cliche now. It's like, this is why Trump won, or welcome to another 4 years of Trump. And it's weird to me that these people who are so competent in certain ways are incompetent in understanding, or don't want to face the fact that they cannot control the conversation. These people who can control the world insofar as Apple and Google can control the world, right? These people who got to positions of power by being efficient with the ways that boxes are shipped around the world, like Tim Cook, right? What gave him the ability to decide what's a sin and what's not a sin? I mean, in his speech, he accepted an award for courage against hatred by the Anti-Defamation League. And in the clip that I saw, at the end of the clip I saw, but he talks for more, he says that our innate desire to distinguish between right and wrong is something that we have to act on, and not to do so is a sin. Now, you've spoken with Haidt?
Yes. No, we haven't interviewed Jonathan Haidt.
Okay. But you're aware of his ideas.
Yeah.
And one of his ideas is that he speaks about at length in The Righteous Mind is that what we say is right and wrong is not the same as truth. That's like right and wrong are my will, what I see, what I choose. So Tim's formulation that our innate ability to distinguish between right and wrong, he thinks he's saying one thing, but what I hear is that we know what's right for everybody else.
Yeah.
But which means that we can't possibly be wrong because we know what's right. And it's a sin to disagree with us. It's a sin not to enact our righteousness onto the world. But this guy's not qualified to do that. He's not a theologian. He's not a moral psychologist. He's somebody who's good getting companies to produce billions of objects. That's what he's good at. The same thing with Hollywood. Why does Hollywood think that it has the ability to dictate our morality? How did they get into power? By seducing us, by doing the opposite of promulgating morality. And now they want to turn around and promulgate morality, right?
Yeah. It's enough to turn you into a Trump supporter.
Well, what's the other option? That I'd rather have him. I can see the frame of mind. I shouldn't say I'd rather, but I can see the frame of mind that would rather have that than this other thing. Yeah,
what we've called in the past the liberal shadow. This sort of tribalism that pretends it's not a tribalism.
Oh yeah.
It says we're completely open to everything apart from the people who don't think like us.
Yeah.
And that is pretty much what we're seeing. And I'd hope that the Trump election would have been a wake-up call to liberals or so-called progressives to actually see that, at the very least, it's not working. The tactics aren't working, and let alone this deeper sort of level of corruption that is in this very arrogant way of looking at the world and assuming that they know best. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing a doubling down in so many areas, and I think this is part of that doubling down.
Yeah. What the tech companies are doing is part of a doubling down, but I really do think that is not representative of people who are center-left. I think the center-left have all been shoved over to literally shoved over to the right just by speaking, such as Brett, right? That there's that weird. There's like in America, there's this I guess this interpretation of American politics slowly getting more and more right over time. Like the Democrats used to be kind of left, but with neoliberalism and with the Clintons and then with Barack Obama, everything's kind of shuffling more and more to the right. On one level, that's true. But at this, almost like in reaction to that, in reaction to Trump, is this exclusivity that doesn't really understand or is working against the principles that would actually give it strength, which would be true diversity, beyond the surface diversity. And but I want to stray away or push against the conception that thinks that the left is in and of itself destroying itself. I think that there's an idea that's using left leaning people to destroy and to liquidate the left. And I think that's playing into the hands of the right, or playing into the hands, I don't even think playing into the hands of anybody other than people who make money, people who actually control the things that really matter, which would be money and economics. I think it's ultimately playing into the hand of a class structure. Not that I'm against hierarchies or class, but...
We're not yet seeing people deplatformed for talking about certain subjects, full stop. We are seeing people deplatformed for words that they've used and for overstepping the bounds in ways that, I certainly wouldn't have used the word that Sargon used, but I understand that he meant it in the particular way that he did. And I think if they were willing to look at it in the context of how he used it, he could be given a warning. And I think I've seen I think Tim Pool put something out earlier on saying if Sargon had been given a warning, that would have made sense. They said, look, we realise that you used this word. this is not appropriate. But again, he didn't actually use it on Patreon, and Patreon have said that it's only for the material that you're actually putting on Patreon that their rules of service apply to. So there's a whole load of inconsistencies there anyway, which makes it look very clear that this has been used as an excuse to get rid of him rather than is a neutral appreciation of the way that of someone breaking their terms of service. And again, as he points out in his video, there are people, left-leaning people, who've said far worse things that they seem to have been given a pass for.
Yeah, I don't think that it's sustainable. I don't think they can be consistent. And as soon as they start to be consistent, which they're going to be forced to be consistent, they're going to start ticking more and more people off. Deplatforming is going to be the way for the left and the right to get together, actually. Like the people, like what I'm witnessing within what's happening in the transgender issues kind of network is that you have these very radical people, trans rights activists, who now have the power within Twitter to shut people up. Right? And there's a lot, actually, and what that's bringing to light is that there's a lot of trans people who love debate, who love rationality, who love to think things through and really, really dislike the radical activists, really don't like that. And so what's happening, like, who would have thought this, but what's happening is that these transgender people are starting to speak out, and the conservatives are now like, oh, finally, like a rational trans person, like a non-crazy trans person. And then in that is that the conservatives, maybe a cultural conservative or somebody who's very conservative, like in just their conception of gender, is now being exposed to somebody who they agree with, and yet still, but categorically have a problem with. And that category is now being transcended by by the content of the character.
It's also this realization that people are not a monolithic block, and this assumption on the far left that people are identified or people are synonymous with their identity is being broken, because a lot of people don't agree with the assumed views and perspectives that they're basically told that they must have if they're part of this group.
Mm-hmm. And the one problem is that we might need to be entering into a destabilization of what we have now before something better can happen. And by that, I mean, we might need to allow Twitter to very slowly erode and go without. And by Twitter, I'm not talking about there's an addictive quality to Twitter, and that would be sad for me to lose, because I like playing that game. But it's actually a way for me to connect with people. I find people that are interesting. I find people that I interview, and then I find audience members, and it's very useful for this project. And I might have to go without that. I might have to go without YouTube. I might have to go without funding. I might have to set up a PO box and say, I can only take like checks now. And I know nobody has checks anymore. So there might be like this, we might need to abstain before another viable option comes around.
Well, maybe we should all move to checks and then tell Patreon that that'll teach them. Yeah,
but then the paper and ink companies are going to let the power go to their head, and they're going to want to control who can write checks and who can own checks and who can cash checks.
We're screwed whatever happens.